Nice.
Yeah, just so everyone knows, right? Everyone's aware and to be recorded. Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and begin. And what I want to do today is a couple of things. I want to go over some of the major concepts we talked about for last time in chapter 18. That you're doing your assignment on. Does anyone have questions about the assignment that you have on the books right now?
That's
The-
D2
Yeah,
then? Symbol of that?
yes,
Yeah.
John.
Just what we went over.
Yeah, it's the assignment. Let me pull up the assignments. Maybe that's a good idea.
So it's obviously like the two that we did with group and then just,
Oh.
and then
Yeah.
the other two.
Let me pull this up. Let me make sure we're all.
That's one question I have, like how we, way, the paper says is just discuss in class.
No, but this is the assignment. You need to go onto Canvas, and this is where the assignment is. So, Aaliyah, can you see what I'm doing on the screen?
Oh,
Okay.
okay, it's a different page.
Yes.
This is, I didn't hand this out. So this is just on Canvas.
I thought it was.
Right, which is understandable. Okay, so then, what I would like you to do is just each of those events, so for all four of them, respond to each of these questions for each event, right? So for each event, there should be 3 questions that you respond to. Identify and describe each of the events listed above, including the dates and specific names of the people or groups involved. Be sure to begin your response with the name of the event you are describing in your answer, so I know what you're talking about. Then 2, explain how each event was a factor leading to the start of the Civil War. 3, of these events, which one was the biggest factor? Explain why. Okay, so number 3, obviously, that doesn't apply to all events. You're gonna pick one that you think was the biggest factor. Okay, and so I'm looking for at least a couple of sentences. So 6 sentences for each event if you're answering all of the questions. Does that compute? Is that clear?
No.
Yeah. We're good. Okay, Aaliyah, you have any questions about that?
No.
Good. Okay, so let me go. All right, so no questions about this. We're good. That'll be due on the 18th, which is next Tuesday. So let's go back to where we were. I wanted to pull up the PowerPoint and just go over a few things from chapter 18 to kind of solidify. I know that the Kansas-Nebraska Act seemed to cause a little bit more, or there are more questions about that, so I want to talk about that. Okay, so here's our title slide. I'm going to go very similar to these. All right. So, okay. So just to kind of recap here, popular sovereignty was one of the concepts that we talked about in that project, in that class activity that we did. So people of a territory under the principles of the Constitution should themselves determine the status of slave. Right, what does that mean?
Basically the choice of a territory being free or slave territory, slave owning territory, was up to the population rather than being guided by Senate and like inducted.
Yeah, so rather than Congress in Washington DC making that decision, it was the people who were living in the territories. So they thought this was a good idea. Clay thought this was a good idea because he thought, well, this keeps with our idea of democracy, right? And the Constitution, let the people of the territories decide what the fate of their areas were going to be. Okay, and so you'll talk about why this was a contributing factor, right, to the Civil War. Because it sounds good, right? In theory, it sounds good, but it caused problems. And we'll see, Kansas is a good example. We'll see how that worked. Okay. All right, so I wanted to also talk a little bit about the Free Soil Party, which becomes kind of a major player in this. So this is a new political party that develops around this time. But I wanted to make sure that we're not having any confusion between Free Soilers, members of the Free Soil Party, and anti-slavery or abolitionists, because they are not the same and they don't have the same beliefs. So the Free Soil Party, they are organized around the issue of slavery or the institution of slavery, but they have a different take on it because for them, it wasn't so much a moral aberration, that wasn't their biggest concern. What they really wanted to see is that it was really more in the interest of poor white people, poor white men, that they would, that the institution of slavery would, you know, quote unquote, take jobs away, right? That if you have this institution of slavery in place, then that takes away job opportunities for poor white men. Okay, so that was that's why they wanted to keep the territories free. Not because they were abolitionists, but because they saw this as kind of economically unfair to the poor white men. Okay. All right. Let's see here, the Underground Railroad. So this is important. So the Underground Railroad, you've probably all heard of that, right? The Underground Railroad, we're all taught that usually in elementary school, junior high. This was actually a very important development and causes a lot of friction between the northern states and the southern states. And so the Underground Railroad was not a literal railroad, there weren't trains necessarily, but it was a route that was taken by people who were wanting to not be slaves anymore, and to be able to find freedom. And so there were people along the route, and the route ran from the southern states all the way to Canada. And so people who supported this would assist we call them freedom-seeking people in getting to Canada. Okay, so Harriet Tubman, you know, very famous. She was responsible for rescuing more than 300 slaves just herself. So that was something that was problematic in the eyes of the South, the plantation owners, the slave owners, because the loss of slaves to them became a really big problem. And this just furthers the tension between the northern states and the southern states. Okay, so this is why the southern states wanted a new fugitive slave law, and they wanted it to be a stricter law. The former law had been on the books since, I think, 1793. Okay, and it's actually the fourth, it's within, in Article 4, it's in the Constitution. I'm just going to point it out to you. If you look at the Constitution, which is in your book, under Article 4, Section 2, it says, fugitives from justice must be surrendered by the state to which they have fled. Okay, so that was written for enslaved people who ran, this is hard, the language is hard. Because all the language that we use up at this time is not appropriate anymore, so I'm struggling just trying to get that out, so I'm not gonna apologize, but, I'm doing my best. So anyway, that law is in the Constitution, and we always think of that law as, oh, well, that's how, people who are accused of crimes in one state get extradited to another state, right? That's what that law is. We think of that's what that law means, but that was actually a law written, that was the original fugitive slave law. That was written especially to combat the problem of slaves escaping slavery. Okay, so the southern states thought this is not strict enough, this doesn't do the job, we're losing too many people. And then with the Underground Railroad, that made it even more problematic. So that's why there was this demand for a new law. Okay, and so that, as we talked about last time, was part of the Compromise of 1850, right? So Congress passes a new law, a much more strict fugitive slave law that infuriated the North, right? We talked about that last time. All right. If anyone has questions, let's know, just ask. Okay, so this is a good slide. I wanted to show this to you today too, because it gives us a sense of where we're at in terms of free states versus slave states. Okay, so you see the gold represents, and also the sectional balance, in Congress, in the Senate, specifically. So all the gold, these are all slave states, okay? And then the purple are free states or territories, right? Because all of this this is all territory, except for California, it's admitted, okay? And then, okay, so the numbers represent the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. Okay, and then this is where the real controversy is going to be later on. You have Utah and New Mexico that are still open to slavery. And then we'll talk more about Kansas and Nebraska as well. But that just gives us a sense. So it's interesting how politics is such a part of this, right? I mean, part of this controversy, there's of course the moral question of, having human bondage is morally wrong, there's that. But there's also this political issue of having some sort of balance between slave states and free states in Congress. And that was a huge concern because of power. And basically, the southern states' concern was to be able to preserve this economic system that they had developed over the last 100 plus years, more than that actually. And that was the heart of the concern. Okay, so we talked about the fugitive slave law. All right, so a little bit more about the reaction to it in the North. So people who just considered themselves moderates, kind of middle of the road people in the North, this law caused them to move further towards abolition. And so states actually responded, state legislatures responded and passed these personal liberty laws, which, basically said things like, in our state, we are not going to comply with the fugitive slave law, because the fugitive slave law was a federal law. So then the states would pass laws that would counter that federal law. It's kind of like, I don't know if y'all recall a few years ago when, President Trump was in office and he, through executive order, implemented much more strict rules on immigration. Y'all remember that? Okay, so there were cities, which that gets more into local government. I'm not sure if they were whole states, but local governments that said they passed ordinances, they passed laws that countered those orders saying we are not going to assist federal agents in enforcing these laws. Okay, so this is a similar situation. You had state legislatures passing these laws, saying, you know, we are not going to comply with the fugitive slave law. Okay, and so that really, the book is interesting because it calls this a blunder by the South. Like if the South could have been, you know, more conciliatory about this, maybe they wouldn't have angered the North. I don't know. It's a theory. So I haven't seen any research on it. But what happened is the whole situation escalated. The Southern planters became more angry as they saw this law, you know, pretty much being flouted. Okay, so the book proposes that maybe shooting could have started in 1850, because things are getting bad. All right, so let's go ahead. Gadsden Purchase. The Gadsden Purchase is an interesting, I don't talk too much about it, but it is interesting. It is important because it does highlight the issue of the railroad. This is another complicating factor in this whole drama that we're looking at. You know, railroad investors wanted to see a transcontinental that is all the way, you know, coast to coast, sea to shining sea railroad built across the United States. And there was this competition to have it go either through the northern states or through the southern states. And part of that was the land that we know as like El Paso and Las Cruces, right? Deming, Wardsburg, to go all the way to California. And so the US was actually able to purchase basically where we live now, Las Cruces, in the Gadsden Purchase. And that was all with the intention of having that land be available to build the railroad across our part of the country. And that was important because this is a major source of revenue, right? You know, people's livelihoods depend on being able to, you know, if they grow crops, if they produce goods, to be able to move those goods, to sell them, to put them in the markets. Okay, so yeah, this just, I think, says what I just said. Okay, so $10 million. It was a good deal, a lot of land for $10 million. All right, and here's a nice map of it. So it's this area in green. So that happened in 1863. All right, and this was the route of the railroad that would be built all the way to Los Angeles. Okay, now we get to Kansas and Nebraska. Let's see, I'm just moving my notes here for sure. Covering everything. Okay, so moving forward. Here we go. Okay. All right, so this conflict arises over the building of the railroads. And so because the railroads needed to be built, these territories in Kansas and Nebraska had to be organized so that they could become states soon in order that those railroads could be built. And so Stephen Douglas, who was a senator from the state of Illinois, he wanted to kind of find a middle ground. He wanted to be able to solve this crisis so that the railroads could be built, because they're not going to get built as long as there's this crisis going on over whether or not Kansas or Nebraska are going to come in as free or slave states. It's important to note he was a heavy investor, okay, in real estate and railroad stock, right? So he has kind of a personal stake in this issue. Okay, so he proposes this idea, which would become the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, so we talked about this last time, so we don't have to go into too much detail. basically the deal was that the issue of slavery was going to be settled by popular sovereignty in both places, but knowing that Kansas would probably become a slave state, okay, through popular sovereignty, and that Nebraska would probably vote to become a free state. Now, the problem with this, and y'all talked about this last time, is what happens to the Missouri Compromise, right, from 1820? If the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, what happens to the Missouri Compromise? William has Sure. But yeah, so what do we do with the Missouri Compromise? Yeah, it's nullified, right?
Voided.
Yeah. So that's bad because that sort of, 1820, we're talking 30 years prior, a little bit more than 30 years prior, people thought, oh, this is going to solve it. This is going to solve the problem for now. All of a sudden, everything is undone. Okay, so this is another good map that I like. It illustrates the issue well, I think. So we can see, and this is in our book. This is the area we're talking about. So here's the Kansas territory, there's the Nebraska territory, and there's the railroad. Okay, and so an important line to see is this is 40, right? That was the line of the Missouri Compromise. But we can see that Kansas extends all the way up. And so right there, that qualifies. Oh, I'm sorry, I take that back. This is the line. It's down here at 3630. Okay, so if Kansas is going to become a slave state, then that's how this nullifies the Missouri Compromise. Okay, and upsets the balance, sectional balance. Okay, so it does pass Congress, we know that, and we also know, we can talk more about this, why this became so controversial, why it was so controversial. Because the Northerners who were anti-slavery was very upsetting because it nullified the Missouri Compromise, and they thought, well, you're reneging on the deal. And it made all future compromise with the South more difficult. So in other words, it's like, if you're in a family and you ever have family arguments, things that go wrong, somebody says the wrong thing. It takes a while to kind of heal from that, right? Well, this is like that. Okay. The Northerners were very upset, and trusting the Southern states was going to be difficult. And it was going to make it difficult to come to some sort of compromise. Okay. And so the book says it made the fugitive slave law a dead letter. What it means by that is that if the Northern states were already working against the fugitive slave law, this really nails it. Okay, and the Northern states are deciding, no, we're not going to comply at all with the fugitive slave law, just despite the Southern states. Okay. Okay, so this is important. I just wanted to call your attention real quick. So a new political party rises up. The Republican Party comes out of the Midwest. And so the Republican Party at this time was, very much against slavery. And so all of those partisans who were against slavery, whether they were free soilers or whether they were abolitionists, kind of come together and form the Republican Party. And so by uniting, this is going to become a very powerful party. And we're going to see a president elected from this brand new party. Okay. And it just happened almost overnight. It was really quick. And the next election in 1860, we're going to see Lincoln, who was a Republican from this party, be elected president. Okay, so that's the end of this one. So hang on, let me go on to my next. Any questions, comments? Does that help with the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Is there any more questions about that? That need to be clarified? So let's look at. Is this helpful? All right, so let's go to chapter 19. It's 3 o'clock, but we're in good shape. Okay, so the book title is Drifting Toward Disunion. That's exactly where we're going. Okay. So we're going to talk more, chapter 19 talks more about additional factors that will lead us to civil war. All right, so just a quick look at the chronology here. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which becomes very influential, especially in the northern states. That really helps the abolitionists. 1854 is when the Republican Party forms. Let's see here. And we have an election in 1856. And yeah, the start of violence in what's going to be called Bleeding Kansas. We're going to spend a lot of time on the Dred Scott decision. Okay, in fact, that'll be your next assignment will be about the Dred Scott decision. Okay. Yeah, in 1860, Lincoln's elected. 1861, 7 states secede from the Union to become the Confederate States of America. All right, so first let's talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it's interesting in history when a book, a novel, I mean, this is a work of fiction, has so much influence in a society, but this is an example of that. This book was a bestseller. It sold millions of copies. And so the impact that it had is that Harriet Beecher Stowe actually wrote this book, and this goes back to the fugitive slave law and what an impact that had. She wrote this book as a response to the passing of the fugitive slave law. She was so upset by it that she sat down and she wrote a novel. And so people read this book in droves, and after reading it, decided they weren't going to obey the fugitive slave law either. This is mostly in the northern states. Okay, so it has a huge, huge influence. The book itself dramatizes the horrors of the institution of slavery by really evoking emotions of sadness in those people who read it. And like I said, it was enormously successful in terms of sales. So has anyone ever read it? You've read it for like a school thing?
Yeah,
What do you,
long time ago.
oh, do you remember anything about it?
Barely,
Okay.
but I have read it and I still have it.
Oh, okay. Put it on your summer list. Just writing that down. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I think I just said this. Oh, and it was translated into many different languages. It was an international bestseller. And yeah, I mean, it was a political force. Okay. And it really, brings out the evil that the institution of slavery was. All right, so this is just a picture of what the cover, well, I think this is a promotional poster advertising it. There we go. Okay, so let's go back to Bleeding Kansas. Let's talk about that. So partisans on both sides of the slavery issue, okay, make efforts, this is interesting. All right, because people thought, oh, it's gonna solve everything. Kansas, Nebraska Act will solve everything, we'll know how it's gonna go. But the unexpected happened. Probably the worst that could have happened. Because you can't predict human nature, right? You can't predict how humans are going to respond. I think I've lost it.
I'm sorry, my playing.
That's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose you. Okay, back to our story. Yeah, you can't predict human nature, right? You can't predict how things are gonna go and well, I'll say more about that. But I think this is a good example of how unpredictable and combustible humans can be. So people thought, okay, they really wanted to influence the outcome of these, because there would have to be votes taken by the people in these territories to determine whether or not, Kansas, we're talking about Kansas here, whether or not Kansas is going to be free or slave state. And so, you know, how can you influence that by making sure that your side has more votes, right? Okay, well, that's what happened. But the way that happened was each side, people on each side of this issue actually paid for and sponsored people to migrate to Kansas just so they could set up homes there in order to vote for that side. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. So, you know, on the anti-slavery, the abolitionists, they sent people to Kansas, they paid for them to go to Kansas, you know, make your home there so you can vote on this thing and make Kansas a free state.
Like buying votes,
What's that?
buying votes.
Well, yeah, kind of, yeah. And believe me, this is a time, this is a time of Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall is New York City. It's not the same, but I just want to show you that there's a parallel. You know, you vote for my candidate, and I'm gonna make sure you've got, you know, soup on the stove and you've got a steady paycheck and that you've got a job. So it's kind of the same thing. We'll finance your move out to Kansas and we'll help you get settled. Just make sure you vote on our side when this election comes up. Okay, so of course this angered the Southerners and said, whoa, you know, what are they doing? And this was a company that New England Immigrant Aid Company was actually set up to do this, and 2,000 people were sent to Kansas by this company. And they carried rifles, and they were ready to do battle over this issue. Okay, and yeah, Kansas is definitely the worst, an example of the worst possible scenario that could have happened. Why am I not? It's working fine a minute ago. Oh, I think we had technical difficulties. Sorry, folks. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so people on the other side of this issue, of course, were very upset by this development. Wait. Okay, I did. We're okay. Yeah, and so the pro-slavery partisans then decide, okay, we're gonna send our own people there so that we can have a bigger voice. So they start sending owners of enslaved people to Kansas to respond to these people who are coming from, sponsored by the abolitionists. It just becomes a big mess. And so there isn't yet in Kansas, it has yet to be formed, a proper government, right? So people who are living in Kansas still have to set up their legislative body. Are you following me? You know, they have to have a legislature in order to pass laws. And so they haven't really set that up. So each of these partisans, right, each side of this issue decided, you know what, we need to make sure that we win. So we need to make sure that the legislature is set up so that we have a majority. So what we then have are two legislatures that are created. Okay, so in 1855, that was when the first territorial legislature was elected. Okay, and so people would come in from Missouri to try to influence the election voting early and often. So kind of the same thing. And that was the anti-slavery section. And then supporters of slavery set up their own territorial government in another part of Kansas. Okay, so there were literally two governments in the Kansas territory. Yeah. And if you're confused, don't worry, it's confusing. You know, it's hard to keep all this stuff straight.
Fighting for territory.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because it's, at this point, it's political, right? So there's no shooting yet. Yeah. Yeah, that's coming next. Okay. And what's ironic is that the institution of slavery never really catches on. Yeah, so it's a crazy, crazy atmosphere. And then John Brown comes along. I've heard of John Brown. Oh, so this is I talked about shooting. Yes, shooting happens. This map shows us. These are all violent conflicts that happened in the Kansas territory, starting in 1856. The red are attacks by pro-slavery forces in Lawrence, and then in Osawatomie. And then John Brown comes along in 1856, and he, I think the book says he butchers 5 people, murders 5 people that he and his people believe were pro-slavery. Okay, so this kind of begins the violence, and it's really not going to stop after that point. And we can say that the Civil War kind of begins in Kansas. Let's see here. All right, so yeah, so John Brown, he was an abolitionist who was obsessive about this issue, extreme in his beliefs. And so, yeah, he went to, what did I say? Potawatomi, I never pronounce it, Potawatomi, and murders these 5 people he believed were pro-slaverites. That brought retaliation, and 1856, we can say, the war begins. Okay, so to make it even more complicated and confusing, so the Lecompton Constitution, okay? So the Lecompton Constitution was a proposed state constitution for Kansas. Okay, so that's one thing about when territories are going to become states, they have to have a constitution. The people of the territory have to get together and have a constitutional convention with delegates that represent the people, and together they write a constitution, kind of like what happened in the United States Constitutional Convention in 1787. Okay, so this Lecompton Constitution was something that was proposed by the pro-slavery people, and what it stipulated was that Kansas, basically what it boiled down to is that Kansas could not become a state without slavery. And so I found kind of a more extensive explanation of this, and it says it was ratified after an election in which voters were given a choice only between limited or unlimited slavery. Does that make sense? So, in other words, is the choice to be a free state in that Constitution. No, it's not at all. Okay. And so people who were pro-free state just didn't vote. They just refused to cast their ballots. And then the president of the United States at this time is James Buchanan. And he tried to get Congress to admit Kansas as a slave state under the Lecompton Constitution. But Stephen A. Douglas, right, from Illinois, he was anti-slavery. And so he and people who were also with him in the Senate, in the House, blocked the bill. So they made sure that the bill was to admit Kansas into the Union as a slave state. That failed. All right. I hope that all makes sense. All right, so of course this causes more consternation. Finally, in 1858, the voters of Kansas rejected the Lecompton Constitution, and then later on in 1861, Kansas is admitted to the Union as a free state. So goes the battle for Kansas. All right, let's talk about that. Okay, and this is an incident, you probably have heard of this. Tensions got so high that on the floor of the United States Senate, it came to blows, literal blows. So Senator Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts. He gives a speech on the floor about the crimes against Kansas. And it's really insulting to the pro-slavery men. It condemns them. He insults Senator Butler from South Carolina, and there's a quotation. He said, "Pro-slavery men are hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization." Okay, so those pretty extreme words. All right, so Senator Brooks, Congressman, he's in the House of Representatives. He did not like this. In May of 1856, he found Sumner and literally beat him up with a cane, an 11-ounce cane, until it broke. He injured him very seriously. He was bleeding, he was unconscious. And it's just an example of how extreme this issue became. This is happening on the floor of the Senate. And this is a very famous illustration of the beating taking place. I don't know if that's what it really looked like, but that's a sketch. Nobody had a phone to record, to take a video recording of the event. Okay. Questions, comments? No? You good, Aaliyah? Yeah, okay. Okay, so next, more political bombshells. Now we want to talk about the Dred Scott case that went to the United States Supreme Court. So your next assignment is going to be about this decision. You're going to have a short essay, written assignment on this decision. And we'll talk more about the assignment next time or later on. Yeah, next time, we'll talk about it next time. And we're going to do an in-class activity as well, but I wanted to first kind of go over the background to give you some context for the decision. So this was a case that went to the US Supreme Court. The center of the case was a man named Dred Scott. He was an enslaved person. He lived with his master in Illinois and also Wisconsin. He lived with him for 5 years. Okay, so then because he was living in a free territory, Dred Scott sued for his freedom. Okay, so he had lived for 5 years. This helps explain it. in Illinois and Wisconsin, they're both free, Wisconsin is a free territory. And so he said, wait a minute, shouldn't I be free if I'm living in a free territory? So he sues, he goes to court and he sues for his freedom. Because he had been living for so many years in a free territory. Okay, the Supreme Court did not rule for Dred Scott. And the decision is going to wind up being an important, an explosive event that takes the country further to civil war. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about what the ruling was. Okay, so at this time, the Supreme Court, the majority of them were Southerners. Okay, and so the Chief Justice was Roger Taney. Okay, and Taney wrote the opinion. And so he ruled against Dred Scott, saying that he couldn't even sue. He said, you know, this case is not even valid because he can't sue because he's an enslaved person and therefore he's not a citizen of the United States. Okay, so that was the first part. That was the first part. So he's saying because Scott isn't a citizen, he has no right, no standing to file a lawsuit in the federal court. Okay. Now, I could have just ended there. But Taney and the Supreme Court went even further in their opinion. Okay, so they also stated in this decision that they talk about what it meant to be a slave in terms of citizenship. So Taney's opinion said that a slave was private property, and therefore, because an enslaved person is private property, they could be taken anywhere in the United States legally, and they would still be an enslaved person, whether or not they were in a free territory or state. Okay, and so their rationale for this was the Fifth Amendment. Taney argues in his opinion that the Fifth Amendment forbids Congress of depriving people of their property without due process of law. So if they were to rule for Dred Scott, then if this is in Taney's eyes, then that would have been a violation of the Fifth Amendment because they then would be denying the owner of their property, meaning Dred Scott, without due process of law. Okay. And then they went even further because, well, what if someone is in an area that was covered under the Missouri Compromise, you know, in the north? So Taney and the court goes even further with their decision, and they rule in the decision that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and should never have been passed. They said further that Congress had no power to ban the institution of slavery from the territories, no matter what the people voted. Okay, so then what does that do to the idea of popular sovereignty? Yeah, it takes it away, right? It nullifies the whole concept. Okay, so, you know, for the Southerners, in terms of their reactions, of course, they were very happy with this. You know, this was a real boost to their, to this issue for them. People who believed in popular sovereignty were aghast, you know. This was a shock. This is a shocking decision. Okay, I'm gonna stay there. So, and this is it's interesting, the timing of this, because, you know, at this time, with Kansas coming in as a free state finally, and all of the, you know, the violence that's happening in Kansas, the Southern planters are kind of seeing that they may not be able to win this issue. Okay, but then this decision, the Dred Scott decision, kind of breathes new life into their cause and say, well, wait a minute, maybe we can preserve this institution. And continue this practice. Any questions, comments on that? So Dred Scott decision. All right, so what I want to do now is pass out, this is a handout that are excerpts from the decision. The actual opinion is rather lengthy. So I just found, and Aaliyah, this is on Canvas. And you'll get the hard copy next week. I'll give you the hard copy.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, and this, I still have to put this on Canvas, so this will be on Canvas very soon. These are discussion questions that I'd like you to think about as you read, and we're going to talk about this on Tuesday. Yeah. So this will be our activity for Tuesday. So like I said, these are excerpts from the opinion. Now, are you all aware of how the Supreme Court works? Because I can explain that a little bit. Okay, let me give you a little bit of background. I teach that in government. When you take government with me, I teach that. Hopefully you learn that in the online class. So, but yeah, so the way that the Supreme Court, I guess, just to help in this, so cases go to the Supreme Court through a series of appeals. Okay, so Dred Scott's case through a series of appeals, meaning when he first filed the case in federal court in Illinois or Wisconsin, I'm not sure where he actually filed the case, but I'll just say one of those places. He lost the case, so then he appealed it to the next level court, the appeals court, and so he lost it there, lost the case there, and said, okay, well, I would like this to be heard by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't have to accept every case that gets filed to be heard by them. So they get to pick and choose which cases that they hear. So they chose to hear this one. So then the case goes to the Supreme Court, and each side of the dispute has to write briefs. It's sort of like a long, think of a research paper that you write. It's a long paper that you have to write. Talking about, discussing, and trying to convince the justices of your side, that your side is right. And so once the justices hear that, that's called oral arguments. So each side has a lawyer who makes that presentation. They make the argument to the Supreme Court justices. And then once the justices hear that, they go into conference and they talk about it. And then eventually they decide to vote, and they will have a vote on the case. And so it's just majority wins, right? And so here in this case, the majority voted to rule against Dred Scott. The Chief Justice of the court is very important, has a very important role. Oftentimes, they influence how a vote's going to go. And once the decision is made, then an opinion is written, okay, explaining the rationale for the decision that is made. Okay, so what you have here are excerpts from the opinion that was written, and this was written by the Chief Justice, Roger Taney. Okay, now, one of the justices who disagreed, we say he dissented with the majority, he wrote his own opinion. And that's really interesting. I'll try to get it on Canvas so you can take a look at it. But it's almost a little eerie because he predicts what's going to happen in some measure. Okay, so that's what you're looking at. You're looking at just excerpts from what was written to explain the decision and to give the rationale for the decision. So I'd like you to read this. It's not too long, I hope, and we'll talk about it, okay? So take your time reading it. Take notes, highlight and stuff, and we'll talk more about it in class. And they have some pretty good questions at the end that can kind of help you think about it as well. Okay, so is everyone clear? Yeah, you good, Aaliyah? You clear on everything? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to stop moving forward here because I want to pause so that we can talk about more about the Dred Scott decision on Tuesday, and then I will give you the actual written assignment. This is not the written assignment. These are just questions to help you along as you're reading. We'll talk about these questions, but I'll give you the written assignment on Tuesday, and we'll talk about that too. All right, and I ended earlier than I thought I was going to. Okay, so if that's, I'm gonna stop the recording. Hopefully that's enough for my daughter's. I lost that.